Hello students, welcome to your second video on ecology. This one is about relationships within a community. So there's three big ideas we're going to talk about in this section. The first two, energy and matter, have to do with how these things transfer within an ecosystem. So energy is going to flow throughout an ecosystem. The primary source for most energy comes from the sun, and then through photosynthesis it's turned into a chemical energy form that organisms can use. And that energy is going to flow through an ecosystem based on who eats whom. The next idea is matter. So energy will eventually flow and be lost to the system, and you'll have to be re-entered through photosynthesis. Matter, on the other hand, is going to stay within the system. It is going to transfer between different organisms, but then through various decomposers and other processes, it's going to be put back into the ecosystem. It can be used over and over and over again. Those two ideas primarily have to do with who's eating who. This last idea, species competing for resources, that's going to impact how a lot of organisms act and a lot of their life histories and a lot of their evolution, but it won't directly impact who eats who. Okay, so the first idea I want to talk about is the idea of predation. So predation has to do with consumers eating consumers, these things eating each other. When things are being eaten, a couple things are happening. First, they're transferring energy. So energy is going to be transferred in the form of chemical bonds, and then those bonds are broken and rearranged in a way that allows organisms to do what they need to do in their world. Energy can be represented a couple different ways. One way we see energy a lot is the idea of trophic levels. So trophic levels are just a way to classify organisms based on where they exist in these feeding relationships. At the bottom of every trophic level, we call it T1, or the producers, T1 for trophic level 1. That would be mostly plants. Those are going to be things that are able to take energy from the sun or occasionally from other chemicals and transfer them into a form that will be usable for the rest of the ecosystem. So those are producers. Primary consumers are going to be our second trophic level. They're going to be the ones that eat producers. And as they eat producers, energy is transferred up to them. Then we have secondary consumers, which will eat those primary consumers. We have tertiary consumers, which eat secondary consumers. And occasionally we have quaternary consumers, which each eat tertiary consumers. We generally are not going to go any higher than a trophic level of 5, or the quaternary consumer. And the reason why is we can sort of see from this shape, but energy is actually lost at every step, and we'll talk more about how these pyramids can be represented. But by the time you get up to quaternary consumers, there's generally not enough energy left in the ecosystem to support many additional trophic levels. Another way we can look at energy flow, similar to trophic levels, is food webs and food chains. So you've seen these before, but just a quick reminder of what they are. So food chains are going to be just simple diagrams that show linear feeding relationships of who eats who in an ecosystem. So down here, for example, we have our producer, which is grass in this case at trophic level 1, and then we have grasshoppers that might eat that grass. Notice the direction of the arrow shows the direction of energy flow. It goes from the grass to the grasshopper. If there's a toad that happens to eat that grasshopper, the energy continues to flow to that trophic level 3. It can go all the way up to that quaternary consumer. If we were to do a food web, then we would just be taking multiple food chains from an ecosystem and putting them together into one diagram. Sometimes food webs can get a little bit confusing because depending on what they're eating, the same organism can exist in multiple trophic levels. And if that's the case, you just have to be clear about what specific relationship you're talking about. For example, if we had something like algae, mayfly larvae, juvenile trout, then kingfisher. So kingfishers can eat the juvenile trout. They could also eat mayfly larvae. So if they went algae, mayfly larvae, kingfisher, then the kingfisher is trophic level 3. But if it went algae, mayfly larvae, juvenile trout, kingfisher, then the kingfisher is trophic level 4. So when you're looking specifically at food webs, just be careful of that. There's a couple additional terms that we'll see in food webs and in diagrams showing energy relationships and matter relationships. One that we'll see is herbivory. Herbivory is just the word for when primary consumers feeds on plants. Here's a couple cute examples: a tortoise, some gazelle, an elephant. We also have some leafcutter ants. So interesting thing about leafcutter ants is they don't directly eat leaves. Instead, what they do is they cut apart leaves, they carry them back to their nest, and then they grow a fungus on it, and they eat the fungus. So they're kind of like little farmers, and they're getting the leaves to feed their actual food. It's kind of interesting. But they still count as herbivory. The next idea we have are decomposers. So there's two general categories of decomposers, and decomposers do get energy from what they eat, because they need energy, it's why we eat. But they also have a really, really key role in taking matter and transferring that matter into a form that can be reused by other parts of the ecosystem. So if we're looking at carbon or nitrogen or phosphorus, those type of nutrients are just transferred between different organisms in a single ecosystem, and through a variety of processes, they'll stay in that ecosystem. Detritivores are our first category of decomposers. So that term detritus, detritus is a general word used for like the gunk at the bottom of a forest floor, kind of. So it includes dead leaf matter and dead plants and poop and maybe some bones, all that stuff. We just call it detritus. Detritivores are able to ingest that and use it for their energy. So they're heterotrophic, they'll ingest that dead organic matter. Some examples are earthworms, woodlice. Woodlice is another word for roly-polies. They're going to be detritivores, they eat detritus. Millipedes, also dung beetles, a bunch of different organisms in that category are all detritivores. Then we have our saprotrophs. Saprotrophs have a similar ecological role as our detritivores, so they're still decomposers. However, these ones are not going to eat or ingest other things. Instead, they are going to just secrete this digestive enzyme straight onto whatever it is, and then they'll absorb that digested material. So these things generally don't have mouths. They're not able to ingest things actively. Instead, they'll just get their energy through secretions. Some good examples are fungus, bacteria. I think those are the big ones. They still have the same similar role of recycling material, nutrients, not energy. So they're still decomposers. Right here, there's a lovely picture of a chanterelle. Chanterelles are some of my favorite mushrooms. They're really delicious. Okay, so predation and herbivory, the first couple in this community relationships list, those ones have to do with transferring energy, so energy is flowing through the ecosystem, and recycling materials, so matter is cycling within that ecosystem. But there's some additional relationships that don't necessarily have to do with eating anything, and they don't have to do with energy flow or cycling of materials directly. Instead, they have to do with how different organisms relate to each other, but they're still really important because they'll change the way that organisms act and the way they evolve and the way their life histories work. And so we're going to talk really quickly about the three of those. First one I want to talk about is mutualism. So mutualism is a relationship where two or more organisms directly interact and both organisms benefit from the relationship. The example I want to talk about is coral. So coral is a cnidarian. Coral is actually an animal, and coral has a really, really interesting relationship with zooanthellae. So what happens is, this is a general diagram of a coral. Looks really similar to a sea anemone because it is. They're very closely related. And all of this is heterotrophic cells. What happens, there's these zooanthellae, which are basically little tiny photosynthetic algae, and they actually go inside the cells of a coral polyp and they live there. And so what they get from the system is they get some nutrients from what the coral digests. They also get a place to live that's a little bit protected. And then what the coral gets from this system is some photosynthetic materials from the zooanthellae. They're able to do photosynthesis, and so they create sugars that then the coral is able to use for itself. So we have these two different things, this coral and this zooanthelle, and they live together. And coral is actually not able to live without the zooanthelle and vice versa. So they're obligate mutualists, where they live together. Obligate means they have to. So they're obligate mutualists. There's a lot of different examples of mutualism. For example, we've got this honeybee, or a lot of pollinators have mutualistic relationships with what they pollinate, like flowers. So this honeybee is going to have a role in getting food from the flower. It's going to eat some of the pollen, might eat some nectar, but it also has a really important role for the flower because it's going to fly around and carry pollen with it. We can see on its little legs they're totally coated in pollen. As it flies from flower to flower to flower, it's going to move the basically flower sperm, the pollen around, and that's going to help with fertilizing the different flowers. So the bee is benefited and the flower is benefited. A really interesting example, I think, has to do with the relationship that a lot of ants have with plants. So these are some red ants that are living on this particular yellow flower. They are going to get some housing, they're going to get a little bit of food, but in return, the flower is going to get some protection. So in this image, we see these ants attacking this little caterpillar. So this caterpillar would eat the flower, but instead these ants that live on the flower are killing this caterpillar so it can't destroy the flower. So the ants are benefited and the plant is benefited, and this poor little caterpillar is not. Another example is with like clownfish and anemones. They have this relationship where they live together. The anemones have stinging tentacles called nematocysts, and those are going to protect the clownfish from some of its predators because the clownfish predators can't get so close. The clownfish is covered in like a little film of mucus that protects it from the stings of the anemone, but it is going to come in and it's going to eat its food inside the anemone, and so some of the little debris from the food it eats becomes nutrients that the anemone needs. So the anemone is helped out and the clownfish is helped out. Mutualism. Then you have things like this water buffalo and some of these birds living on its back. So this water buffalo is going to have these birds living there, and the birds are going to pick out some of its little, ticks and flies and various things living in it. And so the bird gets helped out because it's got a free meal. And also the water buffalo is going to get helped out because it doesn't have these potentially parasites living on it. So bird is helped, water buffalo is helped. That's mutualism, right? So many examples of two different organisms, both helped by a relationship. On the other hand, we have parasitism. So parasitism is where one organism gets really, really helped, the other organism does not. Often parasitism does not kill the host, but instead the host is just hurt by the relationship. Some examples down here, we've got leeches, here's some tapeworms, mosquitoes, here's some super disturbing little larvae coming out of a caterpillar. All these different things are examples of parasitism. I'm going to talk about this brood parasitism tangent, but I'm going to hold it for a different recording, so I'm going to run out of time here. So I'm going to skip through that and then do that separately so that I can end here with this last idea of competition. So often when organisms are at the same trophic level, they are going to have to compete for access to materials. So that can be at the level of producers, where these two plants are competing for access to soil. It can be at the level of like tertiary or quaternary consumers. So here we have a crocodile, and this is actually a picture of a snake. And an anaconda. This picture was taken in the Everglades, and these two are at the same level, so they're competing for each other. Basically, it comes down to the fact that every organism is always competing with every other organism, and that competition is going to change a lot the way that animals act, the way that they live, etc. As students are so fond of saying, I like to think of it this way: the struggle is real. And that really is going to impact how things act and what they're like. So next time we'll talk a little bit about brood parasitism. Hope this is helpful.